Look, the story of humanity is evolving and adapting to change. Master fire so you can live without being freezing cold all the time.
Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
So, there were wildfires. The week of April 20th, NBC News reported that there were wildfires in South Carolina and Georgia. Seems like it might be a little early for wildfires. April, I don't know. I checked Air Now, and the score in Savannah was 163, so that's unhealthy. We had those in the Seattle area in the late summer, early fall of 2020. It was worse here. It was very bad. It was a worst air quality in the world at the time. And when this is happening to you, it's the front of your mind all the time. It's just a miserable experience. It's not just a miserable experience for some of the people who lost their homes. More than 50 were destroyed, 50 homes. 1,000 were at risk. And last I checked, it was 5,000 acres. The fire was 5,000 acres and was 10% contained. When you hear that, you think only 10%, that's not a lot. But a lot of times they have a plan to contain the whole thing. And an elementary school was evacuated. So we know that fires are a fact of life. In an early episode of the podcast, we planted the flag that society is in effect an unceasing war against nature. So fires do happen, but are they getting worse? And is this just an inevitable part of life, or is it the result of irresponsible environmental processes and or climate change? What do you think?
So I actually did do a little reading on this, and the answer is complicated. So in the past, there were more wildfires, which means that in the present, the wildfires that do happen are worse. And it seems a little strange, but if you think about it, it's because of fuel accumulation. So what was happening is that essentially you would have a much bigger wildfires that happen more frequently. So they burn out the branches and the dried leaves and the various stuff that keeps catching fire and makes fires grow more severe. And so what's happening now is that because of the current situation with things like climate change, it's making stuff drier and hotter. You're getting these much more severe wildfires, even though the frequency of those wildfires is less overall, if that makes any sense. So what they studied, this is from CIRES, CIRES, they had a press release in 2025 where they were citing a report that was published in Nature magazine, where they essentially what they did was they compared the tree rings from the 18th and 19th century compared to now, this century into the 2020s. And what they were finding is that the frequency was really important. The scale of the fire wasn't so devastating because what they found was that trees survived wildfires in the past and grew stronger, but that wildfires in the present are so strong that they're just burning out forests and buildings and structures and stuff. But to your question, is this inevitable? No. There are ways to mitigate these kinds of things. The severity of the damage was mitigated in the past because we haven't seen whole cities and residential areas just burned out completely in the way that we saw in California and the way that we're seeing now in parts of Georgia, where houses are getting burned, structures are getting burned. Clearly, something's making the wildfires stronger, like bigger. And not bigger in terms of the area that they're covered, but in terms of the severity of the fire, the strength of the fire. Much hotter, much faster. But in terms of the other question of is there anything we can do about it? Absolutely. There's so much we could do about it. We could clear huge swaths of land and create massive fire breaks between all settled areas, all residential buildings. May it look less pretty? Sure. Will it be more effective at stopping the spread of fire? Yeah, fire can only spread really if it has fuel to ignite. So if you remove the fuel element, a lot less chance of ignition. But there's other things too. It's the choices that are made in terms of building materials. And there's a long history about that. choices that are made in terms of places where you've got resilient buildings that survive or have at least reduced damage because of materials compared to buildings made out of wood and materials that burn very fast and to devastating effect. But there's a couple of other things that I've been thinking about that are interconnected. This actually has to do with stuff that the Trump administration is doing in terms of cutting funding for stuff or not sending money to disaster stricken areas with as much speed as administrations in the past have done. Because there was an article I was reading in the Seattle Times a while back about how in Placerville, California, they were doing wildfire mitigation, where they were doing this agreement, this program with FEMA, where essentially they were doing all the upfront work to mitigate wildfire damage. They were making more resilient areas, doing they had a whole strategy in place. And the idea was that they would be reimbursed after the fact from FEMA. But the article was about how there were delays in those payments getting paid out to these communities, which was creating problems, right? If you spend a whole bunch of money up front with the expectation that you'll get reimbursed for that money and then the reimbursement doesn't come, that creates trade-offs in other places where that money could have spent. And it creates what's called an opportunity cost, right? That the money could have spent on other things, and it limits the range of options that these communities have for other types of mitigation, other types of preparation, all sorts of things. And so these communities have to make difficult choices, right? This is why having people in place that are competent and do their jobs and having the money go to where it needs to when it needs to is so important, right?
Mhm.
So Christy Noem had that policy in place where no contracts over 100 grand could go forward unless she
Oh.
personally reviewed those contracts and had to sign off on it. I'm hoping that the new director of DHS does not have that specific policy because what it did was created bottlenecks, right? It meant that
Yeah.
there are only one person. If you don't delegate any kind of authority or if you don't delegate any kind of work, then the whole burden heavily depends on how much work you, the person, are willing to do. In Christy Noem's case, to review the number of contracts that they're talking about probably would have taken 24 hours a day of just constant reading. And clearly that wasn't happening, right? Because there were issues that arose. We talked about this for the flooding in Texas, the 911 center, where they didn't know if they were going to get paid. And so they didn't staff them in a timely manner. But do you remember those stories where there were all these things that were happening
Yes, of course.
because of these delays? And so it's really important that at the top end level of where they disperse the money and how, that the priority is to get the money to the places that need it. And clearly that's not happening as much as it has in the past. So that's one of these things are not inevitable. There's ways to address problems. It's just that the resources that exist to address those problems need to actually be applied to those problems. So that's one of the issues that I'm saying. It has to do with the priorities of this administration for distributing funds equally to areas that are
Hmm.
affected by climate. The other issue actually has to do with climate prevention and mitigation and NOAA. So we talked about this earlier in the podcast, many episodes back, how media organizations rely on NOAA and the weather reporting
Right.
centers providing free information so that they can accurately report on the weather and weather events, right? That they can create a narrative and present information in a timely and effective manner because we have this huge infrastructure in place to do that. There's another article in the Seattle Times about how NOAA is facing the real prospect of funding cuts, of research being cut, of the idea that people aren't going to pursue climate research or science if they don't see a path forward in their career or in research possibilities. And this all adds up, right? So if you don't have people in place who know what they're doing in terms of seeing weather changes, seeing climate changes, understanding what's going on, then the ability to respond effectively in a timely manner is limited. So I'm actually
Yeah.
thinking of the flooding thing in Texas, where remember there was that one person who was supposed to interface between all the other people, and that person had been fired. If I remember correctly, there was like the one late night person who was supposed, and so the information was delayed in terms of when it was received by those in charge, the people who would make the decisions. And that
Mhm.
delay led to not good things. And so if you apply that same kind of logic to the whole country, then what's happening is you're creating this sort of blind spot that bad events happen or bad events are on the way that can be predicted, but the speed with which we respond to those events becomes more limited if we don't have the full picture. And this is where science and research and academia, they're super duper important because you have to study past trends to be able to recognize current events and the severity of them. That's what's really important in terms of the value system, because understanding the severity of something affects the speed with which you marshal resources to address the problem, right? Because remember, for a lot of issues, you need an emergency declaration issued so that more resources are freed up from the federal government, that more money, things are expedited in a quicker manner. All these things matter. That's my thought when I hear a story like this, is that the southern states, in particular, I'm thinking Florida, they have this policy where they're not talking about climate change in schools, if I remember correctly, that they're trying to ignore reality. And here's the issue: we can be ostriches putting our head in the sand. That doesn't mean that these events aren't happening. They're still happening. The only difference between more information and less information is the trade offs that we have to make when bad things happen. If you don't know the severity of something, then the trade off in terms of the amount of resources spent is and the priorities ahead of time are different. And that has ramifications down the line. But in terms of other things that can be done, there are real trade offs worth discussing, but there's something called cloud seeding. So literally make it rain.
Right.
In the areas we're talking about where the wildfires are happening, they're currently in extreme drought. So a drought just means there's less precipitation, less water overall. And one way to address that is science, right? That you literally make it rain. You
Yes.
create rain over vast areas, and the rain will slow the spread of fire, right? Water is an effective way to tamp down fires, make everything wet. There are obvious problems there too, right? So it's a careful science, because if you put too much rain, then you could lead to flooding and all sorts of other issues. And that's where trade-offs are super important, right? That societies have to make choices. When I say trade-off, I mean that you get something, but you also have to deal with what the thing you're doing involves. Say you want to build a highway, you probably have to use eminent domain to get people who have property in the way of where you want to put your highway out of the way. And that's where government comes in, is because government can tell people, we will pay for you to move, and you will now have to move, right? Same kind of deal here, is that for some of these kinds of wildfire mitigation issues, they may have to utilize things like eminent domain or things like the various tools that are available only to government to address collective action problems. It doesn't do anyone good to throw your hands in the sky and say, oh, there's nothing we can do. This is just life. This is just an inevitable reality, the fact of life. No, we know that there have been events in human history that the effects have been mitigated in part because of human intervention. So, COVID, the spread of COVID was definitely mitigated because of the Project Warp Speed with the creation of vaccine. The vaccine did in fact make it so that we are not all still wearing masks and not all
Yes.
doing the social distancing. That's a fact of life. Same deal
Good thing.
here,
Yeah.
that there are tools in place that we could use, but for a variety of reasons we are not using. So when we're talking about air quality, for example, China has been wrestling with air quality for a long time. What they have is air purifiers, they have filters. There's also, I was reading some research being done that essentially China's transition to more renewable technologies and green technologies has led to a decrease in the air quality issues. Same kind of deal here. The United States could do that too. There's any number of things that we could do that we're not doing. But I was thinking in terms of climate change, there is actually a precedent for international cooperation that was universal when it was passed. It's called the Montreal Protocol. It has to do with the hole in the ozone layer. Scientists discovered that there was a hole that was occurring in the ozone layer. It provided an issue that affected virtually all of humanity, and that they traced the causes of it to certain types of products, hydrofluorocarbons, and a bunch of other stuff. And if you look at the history in terms of international treaties between when the problem was discovered and when it was addressed through a universal ratification of the treaty, it's one of the fastest international accords ever passed, and it's still in effect. The ozone hole is decreasing rather than increasing precisely because of that international accord. So there are ways to address problems, especially climate change, that are known to work and are working. It's just a question of getting everybody invested in the outcome, right? To make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of the value of doing something and the long term benefits of that thing. And so, in
Mhm.
terms of something like climate change, it has to be meaningful alternatives. So, a great portion of the world relies on fossil fuels for energy, for transportation, for their military. You're seeing that issue play out right now in terms of geopolitics, that fuel prices are dramatically increasing and energy costs are increasing because of the Strait of Hormuz. Because of 20% of the world's oil and gas going through Hormuz, that's affecting the political environments and the economic environments of countries that rely specifically on those fossil fuels for their energy and for their work and for any number of things. So if you transition away from those things towards something that still is a meaningful alternative, like solar, wind, geothermal, turbine powers from the way, like there's any number of things that you can do that aren't fossil fuels, you still have the benefit of energy, but less of the effects of climate change. That's the important
Uh-huh.
thing, is that people still need to see a meaningful alternative and they'll pursue that.
Yeah.
But the United States, unfortunately, is going in a different direction, which is embracing fossil fuels wholeheartedly. And that happening with the Trump administration offering to buy out those wind turbines for $1 billion to literally not make them, which was the most bizarre story. I'm not kidding on
Uh-huh.
that one, where they were given approval to build wind turbines off the coast, and the Trump administration says, "Nah, we're not going to do that. We're instead just going to pay them $1 billion to do nothing." Like, in what universe does that make any kind of
Yeah, I know a guy who will do nothing for free. Let's put it that way.
exact? And I guess it's not do nothing. It's that they were given approval to do a thing, and now they're backing out from doing that thing because
Sure.
they're paid to not do that. But it's the most like inane thing I can think of. Of they were on course to create more energy, alternative sources of energy, cleaner sources of energy, and instead of doing that, we're left with a different situation. And they're just prolonging the
Hmm.
inevitable if you rely on fossil fuels. Because remember, fossil fuels are finite. There's only so
Yeah.
much oil. There's
FFF.
there's
Fossil fuels are finite.
there's only so much of these things. So in terms of talking about the future of humanity, the future of humanity is in the ocean and out in the stars. It's that we have to figure out ways to continue to fuel our endeavors and to provide for the technologies that we want in our lives while moving away from something that is not replenishable. It will run out at some point. It's not clear that there's any way to just suddenly magic oil out of nothing or to magic petroleum from other planets because it takes a really long time for oil to be created and then found. And so this is one of those things where it's like the time to prepare and to invest in the technologies of the future is right now, right?
Hmm.
It's when we have the opportunity while we still have fossil fuels to power everything.
That's
As
right.
it's dwindling, we use the opportunities we have for transportation, for employment. Because remember, modernity is a choice that we're all making every day to participate in it, right? But we can always move away from that into a different direction. It's just a choice. All these technologies, they're all choices that we're constantly making of how to live, how to interact with each other, how to cooperate, and choices change. There was a time where the prevalent way of transporting yourself was horse or a wagon, and it took a really long time to get from one point to another. Now we have options. We've got trains, we've got planes, we've got cars,
Bicycles.
we've got boats, right? We got bicycles, we have segways, right? We got technically we have flying cars. They're just not readily available in the market, but they're on the way. We've got things that have vertical lift. We've got things that can go really high in the sky. We've got submarines. There's all sorts of ways to travel now that didn't exist at all, and society adapted, right? We learned, we grew, we evolved. Same deal here. There are choices that have to be made, and they have to be made soon or now, of how do we mitigate the worst harms of these problems. And there's two directions. Direction one, keep doing more of the same, the situation gets worse. Direction two, figure out a way to not keep doing more of the same. Situation hopefully gets better. There's no guarantee, obviously. We do know that the constant pollution and the other stuff does have an effect. and that effect is not pleasant for air quality, for the severity of wildfires, for the severity of different storm events. Like we understand by research, that's why research is so important, that things are getting worse and that there is a way for them to get better, but we have to take steps to adapt our society to that.
Okay, great. That's all very comprehensive, and there's a lot there. So, just taking a 100,000 foot view here, it seems to me like there is the short term things that can be done, and that a lot of that relies on NOAA data and funding and the type of fire prevention techniques, technologies, and labor that we employ. Then there is the great long term and difficult to control at this point aspects of climate change, which it must be said is going to put the forests of the world and the whole world under greater stress than it had been. Stress in terms of like sunlight and heat exposure. And but that is going to require such society-wide initiatives to control, but triple F, fossil fuels are finite, so while we have them, it is imperative that we get renewables and get that whole thing moving. One quick personal aside. I had some in-laws, or really it was a former in-law, and I would goad this gentleman because he had a habit of spewing alternative facts. And I thought, and he didn't like solar power. And so I would just occasionally drop the sound bites. Anybody with half a brain is in favor of solar power, or something like that. So that was not entirely sociable of me, but I sort of decided to go to him. But then the medium term of all this is what kind of fire techniques are we employing? Whether we're not just going to let it burn, but building the fire breaks, building things of fire-resistant materials. And really, we need all three. We need to consider all three, but the second degree here, the medium term, the fire breaks, the building of good materials, and deciding what kind of techniques we're going to employ that doesn't result in these big fires before we're ready for them. That's important. And I just wonder how much people, and I expressed this on one of the first podcasts, I just wonder how much, if voters were aware of all three of these tranches, they're told it's climate change, or they're told we gotta sweep the forests. But really it's just all these things. But the second one, I think, is the neglected one. So it's good that we bring it to the light. We could have gone like a million directions with that. But go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll interject just there. It's a whole of society approach, right? That too much. If you look at events that happen, a lot of how the media portrays it or how fiction portrays it is that you've got heroes that will show up and save the day. But remember,
Mm-hmm.
first responders to emergencies and emergency responders, they're responding to an emergency
Yeah.
to try and salvage what they can at the last second. They're not a fix, right? They're a response to save what they can. In order to prevent a lot of this stuff, it has to be an ongoing effort that doesn't involve emergency responders, firefighters, and all that. That you have to have, in some cases, there needs to be an increase in things like volunteerism, or I'm thinking actually of the Works Progress Administration. So if you look at FDR and the New Deal, one of the things they did was they hired a huge number of people to clear up the national parks, to build roads, to go to remote areas, and to do all this stuff, to do the brush clearing and to build the fire breaks. And you hired people whose entire job was just to go around making stuff better. And one of the issues that I have with the Trump administration, if you pay attention to what's been going on, is that they're trying to cut money from the Forest Service. They're trying to cut money from the U.S. Geologic Service. They're trying to fire people. Remember, there was that interview where Trump was asked, "What you could essentially you could hire people. Why aren't you?" Yeah, I could hire 2 million people today, but I don't want it. I want to move it all to private industry or whatever. It's like, no, there's no private alternative for some of this stuff, especially on national park land and national property, because they won't let the private industry go in. Yeah, they don't, for a lot of these, that it has to be the federal government that maintains its own properties because that's how the law is structured. So if you fire the forest rangers and you fire the
Climate scientist.
and you fire the botanists. I'm actually thinking early on in the Doge effort, there was that story about the guy who studied bugs. His job was to study bugs on trees in forest services. It's not necessarily a climate scientist, it's just the guy who studies bugs, right? If you don't have the
Mm-hmm.
guy who studies bugs and the bugs eat the trees and cause an infestation that makes the trees weaker, for instance, then the wildfire effect is stronger on a weakened tree, right? If the tree is
Mm.
stronger because it's not being eaten out from the inside or hollowed out from bugs, right? If the guy who studies how to reduce the impacts of bugs on trees is fired, you still have the bugs on the trees. You still have the spread of those bugs on the trees. You just don't have the tools in place to deal with it. And you can apply that to everything. To if trees get sick from something, if there's a fungus or something, or if there's some kind of thing that causes damage to the trees that would make them otherwise resilient, then the fire becomes worse, right? Because a dead or dying tree burns up into a bigger flame than the tree that survives. And the tree that survives it becomes more resistant over time because it grows back.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is all interconnected. It's all interwoven that all these things matter. If you fire the scientists who study these things become weaker and they become weaker in ways that we don't necessarily understand because we get blind spots. We get fissures and cracks in the foundation of our body of knowledge. Look, if you think
Yeah.
it, this is where I have real gripes with actually the way that America does some stuff is that there's a sort of need for immediacy, right? That you need immediate results. The things have to be now. They have to be quick, right? It has to be like
Just get the facade right. Yeah.
just get it, make it look nice, make it look good. But the problem is that there's cracks in the foundation, and the way you understand where the cracks are is you study over and over. You study everything. You study the dirt, you study the trees, you study the sky, you study the air, and you pay people to quite literally just study stuff, even if there's no immediate result, because the end result is that it creates a broader, more comprehensive understanding of what's actually going on, not what we see immediately going on, but the long term trends of what's going on, because that gives us better tools to deal with it in the long term. That
Yeah.
it's never enough to go, oh, woe is me, right? The sky is falling, or there's a fire, or there's a tornado, or there's an earthquake, or whatever. What can I do? Just rebuild the same? No. You study, you figure out, are there materials that are more resilient? Are there ways to reduce these problems and the damage that are better overall in the long term? And that all takes money. It all costs time. And if you fire all the people, there's no private alternative that's just going to step in and do that. Look, it's completely irresponsible for the government to say we can only pay people that generate an economic return greater than what we're paying. That's something that capitalism does with private industry. But for government, a lot of what they do doesn't have an immediate return. The return we're gaining is knowledge.
Yeah. A great parallel to that is you hear of the people who say this is a great amount of money per passenger on the light rail if you consider the light rail's construction costs. And my thinking immediately goes to, yes, but we built the rails and we built the overpasses and the tunnels, and that is the expensive thing, and that, while it requires maintenance, is the prize. That's the prize. The prize in this case is the knowledge and the long term effects and the building of the infrastructure, including human capital, to address those non market necessities.
Yes, so actually, that's really important. The human capital part is super duper important. If people
Yeah.
don't have decent paying jobs where they receive enough money that they're not living in a precarious situation, they have more of an opportunity to invest in the things that provide better security in the long term. If people are living paycheck to paycheck, if they don't know where their next meal is going to come from, if they're too scared to go to the doctor because it costs money, that limits their opportunities to do other things. So if someone is dealing with a medical issue that inhibits their ability to volunteer, for instance, in clearing brush from the forest, or to build a fire break, or to contribute to the community, you get less community participation. If you get less community participation across the long term, you have to hire people to do those jobs that otherwise might be done by people who are invested in the long term stability, security, and safety of their community. This
Yeah.
is super duper important, right? That preparing for a disaster is a whole of society approach. It's not something we can just put aside and ignore and just expect it to get better. And
Right.
because it is, in fact, a war against nature, right? Nature
Yes.
usually wins. Volcanoes do win. The volcanoes will blot
Yeah.
out the sky. They will send lava,
Yeah. Yeah.
and lava
And
keeps going until it's.
And just for like first time listeners of the podcast, we're not thinking like war against nature, like chop down all the trees. No, like war against nature in partnership with nature, of
Yeah,
course.
Yeah.
it's figuring
Yeah.
out how to preserve nature while also surviving nature.
Yeah.
How do we survive these events without destroying nature in the process? Because yeah,
Yeah.
technically, right, there would be no more wildfires if there were no more forests. But that's a terrible idea because the forests are the lungs of
Yes.
the planet. We need the
Uh-huh.
forests for something else. That they help
Uh-huh.
us stop the spread of climate change in a different way. They keep us from overheating completely. You need huge forests
Oh,
for
yes.
processing carbon dioxide and there's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. We need the forest.
We definitely do. It's ultimately because, like, society is a war against nature in the same sense that life is essentially a war against entropy. I'm interested to hear if we want to circle back at some point to you said that if you subjected certain types of trees to fires, maybe not extreme fires, those trees would be improved in resiliency. This is probably a known fact, but this is new to me. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah.
So
Go
that
ahead.
was from the CIRES report, the press release. That it's a huge cooperative thing from the University of Colorado Boulder with NOAA, where they collaborate on climate science and studying the past. And what they were saying in this report was that in the past there were controlled burns and much larger fires and practices where the fires were not so severe that they burned down the trees, and that the trees that
Mm-hmm.
survived were more resilient overall. And so the
Yeah.
idea would be, it's obviously, I'm not a scientist, so obviously there's got to be some science to it. There's got to be some careful balance. That's where you would have experts and scientists study what is the size of the fire and all that stuff in terms of burning the forest but not destroying the trees kind of thing. That's a very
Mm-hmm.
complicated thing because this was over a long period of time. This was over 100 years, I think is what they were studying, of fire after fire, year after year. And the idea was that there is a certain amount of wildfires that are beneficial to forests because you
Yeah.
reduce the brush, you reduce the fuel overall, and controlled burns can help with that. But that's obviously something that is what scientists would have to study. But it is clear from the historical record that there were more fires, but the severity of the fires was less, if that makes sense. That the fires may have been over bigger areas, but that the strength of the fire in terms of the heat and the power and the speed weren't necessarily so great that it caused such huge damage to structures and people and places and things. That
Mm-hmm.
idea, I think, definitely
Right.
has some merit and needs more investment and study. But that's where funding the USDA and the Forest Service is so important, and there shouldn't be any cuts to the Forest Service at all in any place. Like you
You know
need
what?
it fully funded. The report that I'm citing was done in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain Research Center,
Mm-hmm.
plus the scientists from CIRES, Cyrus, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but the whole point there is that it was a collaboration between academia and the government studying wildfires in the past to understand wildfires of the present. And that research had to have
Mm-hmm.
been funded in part by taxpayers. It was part of the US government that was collaborating and doing some of this research to understand the scope and severity of wildfires. And so it's really important that there be no cuts to the Forest Service, to any of this stuff, because they're the front line of understanding how to deal with wildfires and how to mitigate the damage of wildfires and how to manage forests and all that stuff. These are all experts who they're hired explicitly to study this stuff, to study forests, to study vast tracts of land. you need an expert really to understand what's going on in terms of the scope and severity, because it's a lot of science, it's a lot of research, it's a lot of studying long-term trends of what's going on in terms of temperature, in terms of precipitation, in terms of wind, in terms of the movements of animals and plants and diseases that affect trees. Like it's all interrelated. And every time one of these individuals is fired, these scientists in the various areas of government that study this, it leads to more blind spots, more areas where we might be able to stave off a really bad thing from happening by doing something less difficult beforehand to prepare for that event. That's the point I'm
Hmm.
trying to make as best I can,
Yeah.
is that when you're hiring a research scientist, for instance, you're paying for them to do the research. The research is the thing. It's not necessarily that it delivers an immediate return, but it's the long term benefit of saving us billions, if not trillions of dollars in damage of built environments and dealing with climate disaster and having to rebuild roads and stuff. There's a whole list of things where the government still is going to have to step in and pay for it anyways if the situation isn't managed. That it saves us money. Like the same argument could be made for things like healthcare and things like
Hmm.
air travel and making sure you pay the air traffic controllers and you have enough air traffic controllers hired and trained and all that. Like that you spend money to get a long-term benefit, even though there's
Yeah.
no obvious immediate return. That's the point of society and government. That if you think of government not as some static thing, but as an evolving tool that humans constantly are tweaking and fixing and adapting to grapple with the current world and the current, evolving situations that affect us, then that means that the people who are hired to study these things are merely the next step in that kind of evolution, that we're moving forward instead of going backwards in time. And here's the crazy thing. Some of the most interesting and important climate research that's ever been done was done by the US military when they were studying. If you read their national security assessment in terms of priorities, there was a point where they released a statement essentially saying, look, climate change is going to affect our military readiness and security in the future. We have to prepare our technologies to mitigate that now. And if you think about it, when Eisenhower was proposing the building of the highway system, the whole
Yeah.
giant highway system in the
Hmm.
United States, it
Yeah.
it was because of the military. It was because of the experience throughout Europe of driving on these terrible dirt roads, gravel roads, and just like narrow little areas trying to get tanks and trucks and stuff, get people and places and things to where they needed to be for the war. And the idea was that you need the highway system so that we can go from one end of the country to the other without these kinds of impediments.
Hmm.
Same kind of deal with climate change. Climate change can affect the stability of infrastructure and roads and all that. If a road's covered in fire or ash or fog or dirt or whatever, that sucks. So at a minimum, we have to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's where
Yeah.
it costs money.
It does. Yeah, I'm thinking that you're really onto something here in terms of describing a whole ecosystem of knowledge, practice, and human capital that it is necessary to maintain in order to, on one hand, have a functioning society, but on the other hand, have some kind of quality of life here. And I can think of certain examples that are much like this that support the idea, and that it does take a government or at least a non-profit motive based incentive structure to keep it up. The first would be open seas. Like open seas free from pirates, where you have navigational waypoints and lighthouses and the knowledge of mariners and the mariners themselves. That is not a default state of the world, but it was brought about, I guess, by the British Navy, by others, by centuries really of piracy doesn't pay, and if you're a pirate, we're going to get you. And then the other one, second one you described, highway system. Now, with a highway system, a lot of people I can drive across the country, and we have trucks, and we're not going to face the problems that Eisenhower faced. Now, people might say, you went too far, we should have more railroads, not so many trucks. When we put the highway through the neighborhood, it screwed up the neighborhood. Yes, true. All that's true, but that's not the reason to, oh no, we're going to throw our hands up and we're not going to do anything. You learn from that and you do it better. Like Vancouver, up in British Columbia, they don't have a freeway going right through the center of town, and so they got beltways and stuff. We learn these things. Third thing, universities and academia. It's been centuries. It's been centuries. We've been close to millennia, really, of professors with students and libraries and the traditions of academia, and that wasn't the profit motive. That was like academic prestige and publishing and the traditions of the various fields, and it all must be kept up. It all must be kept up, and it ain't the profit motive. The profit motive is great when you want to open a fruit stand, but it is not, let's just say it's not for schools. Look at all the tech, the ed tech and stuff, and I guess we'll talk about this later, but when you try to, what's the cheapest way we can teach these students? It doesn't always work. There's unintended consequences. And we're dealing with unintended consequences in terms of all these fires for climate change. But I think we used to say, oh, global warming, it's going to get you. And it hasn't persuaded enough people. But I think if we don't deal with this, you're going to live under smoke. And if people have lived under smoke, even for a week, they're going to realize, oh no, I don't want to do that. So I think maybe this is actually an opportunity for us here to refine the messaging.
My limited experience living with really bad air quality, I lived on the fourth floor of an apartment building for a while in downtown Seattle, and the air quality was at one point the worst in the whole world for a little while. That was bad. It seeps into everything. We had to keep all the windows closed. It was very hard to deal with, and it wasn't pleasant. I 100% agree that figuring out ways to reduce the wildfires smoke and the effect on human populations is super important because we don't know what the long-term effects of the smoke particles are on lung health and all that. But in terms of something you said where it's human-centered, it doesn't necessarily have to be. So this is where technology and progress are important. We could have, in theory, robots that are much more heat resistant and don't worry about getting burned to death, dealing with wildfires as they're happening. That's not beyond the realm of the possible. That there's almost definitely a place for robots and AI and various technologies that have nothing to do with military applications, but everything to do with going into really dangerous situations that humans can't, like lava or underwater or in space or something like that, where humans literally can't survive, but robots can. And doing that. So think of the Mars rover, or think of the Voyager probe in deep space, or think of the various things that have been sent to other planets. That same kind of application almost definitely can happen on Earth, right? If we can figure out a way to create a rover that survives in extreme conditions on another planet, extreme cold, extreme heat, same deal here. We could create robots that will endure extreme heat for very bad wildfires. And what's important is that if those technologies could be developed and invested in, you could deal with wildfires as they're happening, especially in proximity to buildings and houses and stuff. Because at some point, firefighters have to stop fighting a fire and run away, or they have to hide under those blankets. So that leads to issues, right? Where there is some point, there's some moment in fighting wildfires and fighting fires in general where humans can't keep doing it. And investing in technology, in this case, space technology, actually, and ways to go to other planets also has important applications that aren't being utilized, in my opinion, to the effect they could be or should be in terms of dealing with natural disasters and wildfires. That's a part of this whole puzzle that I do think private industry can step in because I'm a little skeptical the government would be the one creating these robots and investing in technologies to do that. That's where you need entrepreneurs and you need invention and you need stuff like that to create those applications.
They would be the buyers later, but to develop them, you're right.
The government would be the buyers. This is actually a gripe I have right now with national defense spending, that a lot of our national defense spending goes to dealing with issues outside of the country. But there is, for some bizarre reason, this weird cognitive dissonance that domestic politics have no bearing on our national defense, and that's wrong. you want a universal healthcare system so that the people who might be volunteering to fight in the military are all healthy and are able to actually participate. It's not enough, in my opinion, to only provide effectively universal healthcare within the military, right? You need the whole population. Part of it too is actually that it creates a distraction for those who are fighting. If folks at home are really sick, right? Or if there's some issue that distracts from the task at hand. That there is a thing with morale that, people having access to dental care, vision, medical care, those are all important in the long run. And the US spends they're asking for almost double. The Trump administration right now is asking for billions of dollars. They want to go over like 1.5 trillion for the defense budget. Almost all that spending is on like guns and bombs and ships and planes. But honestly, some of that spending I think needs to go into things like healthcare and things like ensuring that everybody has access to housing, like all these little things that are about the stability of the country. Because what are you fighting for if you're not fighting for like a meaningful quality of life for the people at home, right? What's the fight? What are you defending? What are you protecting? Misery, precarity, sadness, and that I understand. But if we're looking at history, the answer is almost always like you're defending the property of the rich and powerful.
United States of Precarity, a fiction question mark book series coming by Mike, coming next spring. People don't say that anymore. Coming this fall.
No, I'm not going to write a sad story about precarious situations. But anyways, that's my ultimate take on this, is that there is room in this debate and discussion for emerging technologies and new technologies to deal with these things. That AI does have a place. Robots almost definitely will have a place. Drones, right? Have you seen some of those drone formations out of China where they do those big aerial shows that they make like dragons and various things, that all these like drone swarms that are coordinated?
I gotta say, I'm not up on the drone show scene, but it sounds interesting, I guess.
They're super. If you ever watched it, it's super fascinating. These like very coordinated drone displays. But the point I'm making is that drones could also play, I'm sure, a role of water dispersal, right? So you've got the big air tankers, or not the big water tanker planes that drop water, but there's a limited number of them. But drones, in theory, if you have enough of them, create like a lattice network, like a physical wall between the fire and the wherever you're going, and you can move it around. My point is, there's all these places where these technologies could, in theory, have an application. I just don't see those. I don't see that research being done or those opportunities being taken to the degree that they probably could. We've got a really big country. There's lots of people here. I'm sure there's an opportunity somewhere for some intrepid person to invent a technology to deal with this stuff. At some point, someone invented the fire engine with the giant hose. At some point, someone invented the planes that drop the water and the foam, right?
Yeah.
There's a place for these technologies more than they're being used now, is my opinion on that. But yeah, that's all I really have to say on. I know we talked about this now. That's all I really have to say on wildfires.
Well, because it's the life as a war against entropy topic, so it's old hat for us.
Look, the story of humanity is evolving and adapting to change. You create the wheels so you can move faster. You master fire so you can cook food and live without being freezing cold all the time. You get clothing so you're not cold all the time. It's just a constant struggle to figure out how do we make life better, more livable, more endurable, more survivable. And the answer is a little bit at a time, right? You just one step forward every day. And for something like this, we know there are things that we can do right now that would immediately improve the situation for everyone. In particular, the New Deal stuff, the Works Progress Administration, just give thousands of people's jobs to just go around and clear brush and stuff and build sidewalks and roads and work on the dams and work on everything. Like all the things that they were doing during the New Deal with the Works Progress Administration, bring that back. Bring the Civilian Conservation Corps back. Right? Give people stuff to do. Pay them while they're doing it. I don't like this idea of trying to fire everybody and moving towards AI, because AI is not going to. You need redundancies, if anything, right? You need people who understand how to do things in the case that AI fails. If you put all your eggs in the AI basket and then there's an electrical outage or there's a solar storm or there's some kind of magnetic thing, right?
That's an apt analogy.
Or something happens and all the AI goes off all of a sudden. Okay, who's there to pick up the slack, right? If you fire all the people who know how to do things, who knows how to do things that isn't AI? Right? Have you ever watched Wall-E? All the people sitting in the chairs watching stuff all day, having food delivered to them in the ship
Well,
where they just never
uh,
move and their bones like slowly whittle away.
I've seen parts of Wall-E. Is it like? I guess I don't watch kids movies on my own, but you're saying it's got a meaning here.
Okay,
I should
so
watch it.
one version of the future, if we put too much reliance on AI and on this sort of this ties into the screen time thing you're talking about later,
Yeah.
is that people quite literally just become these amorphous blobs that sit in chairs watching TV and eating food and doing nothing all day, and their ability to react to things becomes severely diminished. They can't move very well. They panic and don't know what to do in situations. When I think about AI and this argument that AI is just going to answer everything, no. You want redundancies anyways. You want people who know how to do plumbing. You want people who know how to do electrical. You want people who know how to do like the basic things that we already understand how to do them. Bricklaying, construction, driving. You want
Yeah.
some pool of people who know how to do that no matter what in case there's catastrophic system failure. If something makes it so that we're sent back into essentially a technological stone age or dark age or whatever, you want people who will be able to rebuild. You have to, no matter what. To do that, you got to pay them. Just pay them to know. Pay them to know things. Pay people to know things, to understand things. Keep them in reserve. And that's one of the issues I have right now. The way the Trump administration has been embracing AI and not regulating AI as effectively as it could or should be is that something gets lost in the mix. An unintended consequence of what gets lost is that we start forgetting things.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good idea to forget how to do things when we spent so much trying to learn.
Indeed. Yeah. Who are you going to learn it from if we all forget it? Have you seen Les Mis?
Oh, it's the actually maybe I Les Miserables, like the
Yes.
musical. Yes, I've seen Les Miserables.
Yeah. I saw it at the Paramount, and I just kept thinking, oh, there's Marius. That's Mike. That's Mike. I just kept thinking it. I can't get the comparison out of my head. Like, lawyer-esque person who says what he thinks and talks about the government. Okay. Here we are. That's why they call it Mondays
With Mike.
with Mike.